Welcome everyone. My name is Heather Meadows. I'm a premium tutor here at Appleworth. I've been with Appleworth for about 5 years now. And this is one of my favorite things to do is to do these presentations and to help kind of demystify some of these things that you kind of get thrown at you once you start the college applications process. So today we're really going to focus on this new kind of buzzwords of test optional, what that means for you and your student, and the best way to move forward with this. Other things about, the differences between the SAT and the ACT, kind of what a timeline looks for your student, those kinds of things we do discuss in other webinars I encourage you to sign up for here at Appleworth. But today we're really going to focus on test optional. So a little bit about Appleworth in general, kind of our why, really working on the whole student, changing their self-beliefs and their confidence in all areas. And we really develop skills for school and beyond here at Appleworth. That's really our kind of our philosophy here. So kind of thinking about tonight, talking about the testing world post-pandemic and test optional. I'm going to have some time for questions at the end. So I just ask that you hold any specific ones till the end. Likely I'm going to cover it during the presentation. All right. So testing post-pandemic, right? The new world is largely test optional at the end of the day, right? You have options to submit your application with or without your test scores. But that doesn't mean it's completely gone, right? And that doesn't mean still taking the test couldn't benefit you, your student, really, at the end of the day. A strong test score can still strengthen it, really, and can still impact that decision. It's just a more complicated process now to think about when do I send it and when do I not send it? And that's kind of what we're going to talk about tonight. So, I think about all along, there have been other things that have been optional all along too, right? Like taking rigorous classes, submitting AP scores, demonstrating interest, doing leadership positions. Those have been optional all along too, haven't they? Doesn't mean they didn't matter. So none of these things are required, but they definitely make a difference. And the same is for test scores now. It's now just become another part of the application that you kind of craft a little bit more. So what does test optional mean? A college will consider your application complete and look at it even if you haven't given them those scores yet. It means you do not have to send it. They'll receive applications with and without scores. And if you send them scores, they'll look at it. If you don't, they won't. It doesn't mean test blind. So test blind is another thing that very few schools do. Some do though. University of Chicago, I believe, is one of the big examples. And that is where they do not accept test scores at all. They will not look at them. Test optional is different. The schools will still look at your scores if you send them. And sometimes they can really strengthen your application as a result. And so more colleges are actually embracing this for the long term, right? Schools during the pandemic were forced to be test optional simply because students couldn't take the test, right? You couldn't put students in a room together and have them test. But a lot of them actually kind of just kept test optional afterwards. For example, I'm here in Georgia, and a lot of the colleges and universities in the state of Georgia have remained test optional, except for the two big ones, Georgia and Georgia Tech. So, and it's kind of expected that really for the long term, we'll see a big increase of this. We'll see some of the schools go back to requiring testing, like the two schools I just mentioned here. But we really see that about 68% of schools that had to go test optional kind of want to remain test optional in the long term. For whatever reason, they found that it really benefited them in the long run. So an example of kind of a study of how this works, right? So Harvard went test optional during COVID, of course. And what they have decided to do is to remain test optional through 2026. That's a full graduating class. So remaining test optional to see long-term, does that affect how many students, graduate in 4 years, right? And that's really the thing, submitting test scores and test scores were often a good indicator of four-year graduation rates. That's what Harvard's testing here. They're actually doing kind of an experiment, right? Which tells us at least for the next couple of years, right, through 2026, we're going to kind of see this ambiguous time kind of remain a little bit until some more evidence, more data is actually produced. And there's a historic number of applications, right? The fact that you don't have to send the test score, and the fact that, again, you don't have to pay the extra $15 or $20 or however much it is nowadays to send the test score to a school means it's a lot more open to a lot more students, right? So we see the applications to NYU, UCLA, Duke all went up about 20 to 40%. That's a significant number if you're thinking about if you're the admissions officer and how much work you're having to do there. And then a really small school like Colgate beforehand, 150%. there's no way they didn't have to hire extra people, right? That's crazy. And so that's affecting it too, right? So even though test optional means you get more applications, would a test score make you stand out? That's the question. And selective schools became even more selective because, of course, there were more applications, right? If we think about in 2019, for example, at the top again, NYU, they accepted about 16% of applicants. Now it's down to 12%. Look at something a little bit further down, like Northeastern. They used to accept 20%, and now it's down to 7%. And then again, Auburn University at the bottom. Auburn used to accept 81% of applicants, and now they're only accepting 49%. That is a significant decrease, right? Especially when beforehand it seemed like Auburn was pretty accessible for most people who applied, right? And now it's 50-50, really. So again, selective is becoming more selective. Maybe, that is the question. Do I still want to submit a score then? Is it going to help set me apart? Ivy admit rates plummeted again, same idea, right? Of course, these were already pretty small, a place like Penn, right? Already admitting only 9%, but down to 4% from that. And Harvard, again, 4.6 or 3.2. But still, even more selective. If you're already applying to these schools, that admit rate is already so slim, and it's getting slimmer. And again, simply because of the volume of applications being sent in, because again, you don't have to necessarily take the test, and you don't necessarily have to send that score in, makes it a little bit easier for most people. So with more applicants and fewer test scores, there's less certainty about, how many students can we get? Colleges have to have those numbers because they simply have to, get their tuition money to run as a program, as an organization, right? So more admissions offices turn deeper to early decision, right? A lot of students nowadays, they don't have to take the test. They don't have to send in those scores. Will apply to more schools in general. But that means those schools are all competing for that student. So they're turning more to early decision. Early decision is when you apply to a school and you say, I'm only applying to your school for now. And if I get in, and if you take me, I'm going to come there. That's an agreement kind of you take there. So more schools are saying that we'd rather take more kids from that pool who we know are going to enroll, and we have kind of a guaranteed class. See, we look here at some of these, which is a little bit crazy. A huge school like University of Virginia, 30% of their freshman class was filled with early decision kids. That's 30% that's already taken up by the time regular decision kids are applying. And even larger for other schools like Duke and Emory, 50%. Again, that's half of those available spots being taken up by early decision. So again, early decision is starting to play a larger role too, even larger than it was before. So why do test scores still matter after all those numbers, right? So test scores are still a hedge against grade inflation. Now students, they don't just get a 4.0, they can get a 5.0 and all these crazy things with the ways that different schools do different scales and such. So now having all A's isn't really super special. Schools want their kids to go to college and they may feel like they need to inflate the grades as a result. Test scores were really a strong predictor of graduation rates at colleges. In the long term, they're really shown them to be helpful at the end of the day. And again, that's what the Harvard study is kind of testing here. They're also a helpful way to compare a broad, diverse group of applicants, which is useful for state schools, right? If you think about a lot of state schools have quotas. They have to accept a certain number of students from each county in that state. And a county that has one high school for all the students in the county versus a county that has 20 high schools is going to have fewer resources. There may not be as many AP classes offered, right? It's simply unfair to compare the number of AP classes the students took to each other, right? But at the end of the day, test scores are an objective way to look at things. All the students take the same test and they get graded against each other on the same scale. It's still a good way to logistically look at all your applicants together and fairly compare them for the most part. And they also will help differentiate students who might otherwise look pretty similar. Okay, the student got all A's, they were valedictorian, they were president of this big society, and they want to study, I don't know, engineering. Okay, well, one of them got a perfect score on the SAT and one of them got about 100 points lower. That's going to differentiate those students for a highly selective school. So again, it's going to be one more thing you can add and you hope that puts you kind of ahead of that other person. And some schools still require testing. So for example, I mentioned a couple earlier, so Florida State, University of Florida, FAMU, University of Tennessee, Georgia, Georgia Tech all still require them. Especially in the South, it's kind of common. And they're also still required for some scholarships. So for example, again, here I'm just speaking from the state of Georgia. In the state of Georgia, not the Hope Scholarship, but the Zell Miller Scholarship still does require a test score minimum to receive that money. And that may be possible, it may be true in other states as well. So again, these are things to think about. They may be required not just for admission, but for other reasons. Right? So a relatively small but significant number of colleges don't use test scores at all. Those are the test blind ones I mentioned earlier. And so, those test blind ones, again, are very small. It's growing though. You'll see a lot of small liberal arts colleges kind of doing this. Again, University of Chicago is the biggest one I know of. So they don't use it at all. That's called test blind. So again, know that those two words do mean different things. So make sure you're paying attention to what the school says on its website. Test blind is a whole different thing, right? You don't send them at all. So you want to make sure the rest of your application is really strong. Not submitting test scores can affect merit aid, right? Like I talked about a minute ago with the Zell Miller Scholarship here in Georgia. A lot of schools consider test scores when they're thinking about who to give merit-based aid for. One good example is the University of Alabama. So they have a couple different scholarships that they offer. And to get those scholarships, you do have to submit SAT or ACT scores in addition to a GPA minimum. So again, here, if you did pretty well on your SAT, you got a 1,300, or 1,350 or so, that's a lot of money. That's $15,000 a year. And you want to send those scores. You absolutely want that money, right? No way you wouldn't want that. So things to think about, right? And so this is a lot of different stuff for every different school, right? You keep hearing that this school may want this school may want this. Throughout this whole process, I really encourage you and your student to sit down and get a notebook you share or a Google Doc you share or something and make a list of the schools they're thinking about. And then, make a table and say, well, these are the questions we need to know. Are they test optional? If they are test optional, what are the test scores, that we're looking for? Be a minimum. Are there any scholarships that are affected by test scores? Ask yourself these questions, do the research on each of these schools so you kind of know going in, if I do test, what score do I need? If I'm not testing, what am I possibly giving up? What scholarships am I giving up, et cetera? So should I send in my test scores? Right now, you've collected all this information with you and your student. You kind of know, this is what I need, et cetera. First thing too, I hate to say it, is to get a score, right? To get a practice score so you know where you're at. That is something you can do through Appleworth. Of course, you can do other ways. Maybe your student has taken a test before and they have an idea of where they're at, but you don't know until you get that score. Once you get that test score, you're saying, okay, I got a 1,200. For this school I'm looking at, a 1,200 is a good bit below what they usually ask for. Maybe I don't send it in, or maybe I try to raise it. For this other school though, a 1,200 is way beyond what I think I would need there. It's healthy, it's right in that range they would love. That's good, I may want to send it to that school, right? You need that number though to start looking. So, that's when you say, okay, is this 1,200 going to add value to my application to this school? It may add value to this school, but not to the other school. And that's totally possible. That's what makes this a little bit more complicated, right? This is just going to be a little bit more time consuming than it was before. Is it something you want them to see, right? Does it make sense, beside your GPA? Does it say, okay, does make sense? Those are both, pretty high of those. Or is for some reason your test score a lot lower than your GPA? Maybe you're just not a good test taker, and that's okay. You want to tell a cohesive story at the end of the day, though. So other things may matter here too, right? So see, there's some kind of recent research, right? Admission rates are really similar between those with and without test scores, except for STEM and business, where students with test scores get in at a much higher rate. Again, right, maybe you want to go study science or math or something like that. And so maybe as a result, you got an excellent SAT or ACT math subsection score, like your score was almost perfect in math. And so maybe your GPA was pretty good. Maybe you have trouble in the humanities. Maybe you didn't do super well in your social studies class or something that brought your GPA down. But there's a whole story there, right? You got an A+ or A in your math class and you almost scored perfectly on that and the SAT, ACT. That tells a cohesive story that you are a much more math-minded person. If you're applying for something like STEM or business, that's a really strong indicator for you. Again, it's thinking about what's the story you're telling here. Also, they matter by major, right? Test scores don't have weight for some students, like fine arts or music or something like that, right? So if your test score is slightly below the average that the school's thinking about, it probably wouldn't hurt if you're applying to that particular program. Of course, this depends on how the school works. Some schools may not do admissions by programs and majors like that. This would be a little bit different. You want to do some research, but this would be for, again, for fine arts, or maybe you have to also audition or something like that. So you want to think about the whole story you're telling here. So it could also depend on your GPA, right? Average scores may weaken it if you have a great GPA, right? Maybe you're an excellent student, but you're just a bad test taker. You get really anxious. That would actually hurt you, right? If you're like, well, that doesn't make sense why their test scores are lower than what someone with this GPA would be expected to have, right? So students with test scores well below their grades, that doesn't tell a cohesive story. There's something missing there. However, on the opposite idea, right? Maybe your GPA is lower. Maybe you went through some personal problems, your sophomore year or something, you did not do well that year. But you came back, you got all A's your junior, senior years, but those sophomore year scores is just dragging your GPA down some. But you have that great test score, right? And that kind of tells a better story there, right? That, I have figured it out. I had a bad year. That's why my GPA is down. But overall, you can see from my junior year grades and my test scores that I'm on top of my game now. Again, it's a story you're telling, right? And these are things you can include in your essay as well, kind of explaining those kinds of things and talking about you as a complete, cohesive person, a complete applicant. Individual section scores matter, right? Like I talked about a minute ago with the math scores, right? Even if your composite score is like, it's okay, it's in the middle range that the school's looking for, maybe that one section is going to, bump you up above everyone else. Not all 1400s are created equal on the SAT. The students applying to a selective engineering program, you have a 1600 verbal and an 800 math. An 800 math is a perfect score. Oh yeah, absolutely, send that in, right? A perfect score in math, that's incredibly impressive. On the other hand, it was flipped around the other way. You have a 600 math and an 800 verbal. I wouldn't send those in if you're applying for an engineering program, right? If you're applying for a humanities thing, oh, great, awesome, right? Just depends, right? And again, these are things to places where you have to specify major, kind of that is a different playing in that larger state schools, this story may not be the same. You just want to look at your school and talk to your college counselor to figure out some of these specifics. But again, think about your whole story that you're telling here. You can't unsee a weak score. And by weak score, I don't mean like a mid-range score. I mean like a lower end score, right? So again, right, we talked about earlier, right, high GPA, lower score than would be expected with someone with that high GPA. You can't unsee it, so it's best not to send it, right? So submitting a low test score way below the desired range can call into question that, right? Makes you think, okay, maybe their GPA is inflated or something like that. That doesn't mean like a mid-range score, right? If your score is kind of towards the bottom of their range, maybe that's not going to, terribly, terribly hurt you. I'm talking about something a lot lower than what your GPA, or something a lot lower than maybe a selective school would expect. So again, just make sure you're thinking about that, right? Don't send those in if you have an option not to. What about the SAT, right? So just briefly talking about a couple of SAT changes. There are no more subject tests and no more essay. And there's going to be some digital testing changes coming in 2023 and 2024. So these are things, again, that Appleworth has other presentations about. I encourage you to sign up for one of those on digital testing. It's its own whole monster, but I like to just address it here so you guys know what's going on in the future. So just a little bit about that digital test. The test will be shorter. You get more time to answer questions. The reading passages are going to be shorter. You'll be able to have a calculator the whole time. Top score is still going to be a 1600. So like I said, more there, but I just wanted to give you guys some of this info just so you kind of know about it, right? You can talk to your student more about those details. But thankfully, Acworth is ready. For over 20 years, we've been working with all the changes in the test. The SAT has already changed on us twice, so we've been working with them the whole time. We currently offer digital SATs and ACTs as practice tests. And as we learn more about the form and format of the digital test, as well as the whole changes with test optional, we'll continue to provide this information to our students and families. And lastly, just so you guys know, we are having a free practice test event November 12th and 13th. So this is free strategy sessions and then free full-length practice tests. So again, if you're thinking about, do I consider if it's test optional or not, this is a good place to start by getting those scores and saying like, well, now this is my kind of base score. Knowing that, do I need to consider submitting scores or not to these schools, et cetera. And then I believe, let me go back. So there's going to be a poll sent to you guys as well. So if you don't, you should get that in just a second. So if you could please fill out that poll for us, it helps kind of know what we are up to, doing a little bit better, and knowing, a little bit more about you guys, help us to better serve you. So I'll give you guys just a moment quickly to do that poll. It should have popped up for you. All right, and while you're doing that, I'll go ahead and open up to any questions. So feel free to send any questions you have through the Q&A function. If you need me to go back to any slide, I'm also happy to do that. So yeah, go ahead and send those in and we can kind of talk more about this. Okay, does a high GPA without an SAT score send a red flag? Not necessarily, right? I think, again, if these schools are test optional, they are going to consider your application with or without that. I think the only thing that would send a red flag in that situation would be a high GPA and a very low score, right? Or a lower score. Let's say you have like a 4.0 GPA, and I would expect, to go with that kind of GPA, I would expect over a 1400 SAT score, but you send in an 1100. Doesn't really quite match there. But yeah, that's just, you just want to match ultimately. Yeah, it's a good question though. Yeah. Oh yes, someone missed the first few minutes. I saw there's some people coming through. No big deal. Can we go back and define test optional? Happy to. Let me see if I'm able to go back. Okay, so go to the end and briefly talk about what is test optional, right? So test optional is, a college will consider your application with or without test scores, with or without SAT, ACT scores. It will receive some applications with and some without. They'll consider them the same. So the question is just, if I send my scores, do they help my application? If so, I want to send them. If they don't help my application, I don't want to send them. That's kind of the idea behind it. And for the first part of the presentation, we kind of thought about, what situations is it helpful in, right? What situations is it not helpful in? What do you need to consider at the end of the day? Yeah, where can I find information about what GPA would match a score range? So unfortunately, that's not really something that I think someone could put out there. That was kind of just off of my experience with students. What I would look at, and this is kind of the good trick for these kinds of things, let me find this really quick. So what I would do though to get some of that information from the schools you're looking at is I would go to the school page or whatever. You would just put this into Google. For example, let's say you're thinking about University of Georgia. You would go online, you'd Google University of Georgia freshman profile. Those are some good words, right? Freshman profile is especially important. If you were to Google that, what it's going to take you to is this page that all the schools put out. It's kind of like their bragging page, right? So what they'll do is they're going to provide a bunch of statistics about their most recently admitted freshman class. It's going to tell you their average GPA, their average SAT or ACT scores, then other stuff too, like how many countries are they from, kind of fun info. But what you would do on that page is you're looking for the middle 50th percent. You want the middle 50% of GPAs and test scores. That's going to correlate pretty closely. That's kind of what you would look at. So let's say, for example, they say the middle 50% of GPAs they accept are, this is off the top of my head too, I'm just making some stuff up. Let's say it's 3.4 to 3.7 GPA. And they would also say the middle 50% of SAT scores we accept are, I don't know, 1,300 to 1,400. Again, I'm just making those up. Those aren't necessarily what I'm saying correlate. But you would go on the website, you would find the middle 50%, and then those are going to be what you're kind of looking for to match, if that makes sense. Hopefully that kind of helps as an example. But those are good sources. And really for every school that your student is considering, I would go to the website and write down these numbers. Again, you can kind of have a shared notebook or a shared Google Doc or Excel file or something to get all this in one place to kind of compare the schools together. Okay, do colleges generally have somewhere on their website, whether they're test optional or not? For the most part, they should on their admissions site. And again, I know it's annoying, but the quick is blah, 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 test optional, quick Google is helpful too. I'm sure there are websites, there's usually a lot of websites that put up these huge charts that are like all the schools that are test optional. I'm sure you can find some of those as well, but yes, they're definitely gonna tell you if they are or not, which is nice, they're pretty open about that. Okay, my daughter's a high school junior now. When would be a good time for her to take the SAT or ACT? This is a common question. The biggest thing that you want to consider when we're thinking about this is, have they taken Algebra 2? Algebra 2 is going to be a really important math class that's going to be both on the SAT and ACT. It's going to make up a large portion of the math. I know some schools may call them by different names and stuff like that. I can't keep up with all the names, but in general, it's Algebra 2 of some sort. And so the question is, when are you taking Algebra 2? Did you already take it your sophomore year? If you took it your sophomore year, pretty much after that, you're good to take the test. If you are currently in Algebra 2 and you are a junior right now, I'd wait till spring of your junior year to really start testing. My recommendation there. But Algebra 2 is really, because there's so much of that on the test, you want to make sure they already have that taught to them already. Yeah, any other questions? These are interesting. Oops. Let me clear this. So again, for you guys to come here, kind of just to kind of summarize what we talked about earlier, this is a whole new thing. It's definitely manageable, but it's just means that it's more work when you're doing this process, more research on your part, thinking about different schools, right? It used to be that, you could kind of write a really nice general essay and send it to a lot of schools and just send your scores off and just send it all and see what comes back. Now it's just a little bit more curated. You need to make sure, okay, for this school, I'm sending this, for this school, I'm sending this. Just a little bit more time consuming. Okay, if you're a junior taking an Algebra 2, is it okay to take a prep course the summer before? Talking about summer before your junior year? You can if you want to, but I would say you're best to wait a little bit. That would be up to you. I would say, so for example, let's see. For example, let's say you are a junior, you're in Algebra 2 right now. Let's say you want to take the ACT, for example. There's a February, there's an April, and there's a June ACT. Those are a good set to do. And so with those, you could start prepping, prep in December through January or something like that. Summer before the junior year would be okay. You could definitely do that, but you would definitely need to refresh as you go on, whether, whatever way that is, whether you have the book or you get an extra refresher class or a tutor or something like that. I would recommend refreshing later on. Yeah. Okay, I mentioned the SAT will change in 2023. Is it better to wait until then? That's an interesting question, right? It's kind of crazy. So what's interesting is the class of 2025 actually kind of has an interesting thing. So it is SAT goes digital in 2024. Can't remember what exact year or exact month, sorry. But the class of 2025 has an interesting opportunity. What you can do is, if you are ahead of your math classes, right? Maybe you're in advanced math classes, you can go ahead and take the paper test if you kind of want to get it over with, right? And you want to stick with what you know. Or you can wait a little bit longer. I think it's spring of 2024, I think. If you want to wait a little bit longer, you can wait till the end of your junior year and take the digital test and see how that is for you. It's kind of an interesting time, right? As far as that, I don't really know yet, right? We're still learning a lot about the digital SAT. My recommendation maybe would to look some more about, try taking a practice digital one. I believe there is one on the SAT website. They have released a practice digital test. Take that, see how you feel about it. Appleworth, I believe, does have a digital SAT webinar too that's going to go a lot more in depth on how that test is different and what the changes are. So I encourage you to sign up for that too if you're considering that as an option. There we go, March 2024, thank you. It's March 2024. Yeah, absolutely. Someone's asking about the practice tests. Absolutely, perfect. Let me clear this really quick. We'll go back and talk about those. Oops. Okay, yeah, absolutely. So November 12th and 13th, we are doing free practice tests for students. Those free practice tests through Appleworth. And so those, I believe, are all digital. And so let's get a confirmation. Are they all digital? Yes, okay, digital options, gotcha. And paper options too, I'm guessing. Okay, perfect. Sorry, I just wanted confirmation before I told you guys the wrong thing. Thank you. So for national practice, or for test prep kickoff, sorry, we are doing both digital and paper options for you guys. Pretty much how it works is you would go onto our website here, appleworth.com/kickoff. You'd pick your time slot. We offer, one test in the morning, one test in the afternoon, vice versa. So if you're like on the West Coast or something, it should work out. And then what you would do from there is you would either do the digital version, you would sign up for the paper version. Paper version, you would need to print off the test at home. And what it is you would have a live proctor for the paper test. For the digital test, it's a little bit different. What that would allow you to do is just take that practice test, input your scores or input your answers and get a score, right? What's nice about this is we are also offering strategy sessions that talk about a little bit about the test. You kind of get a taste of what our tutoring is like. You get some tips, some overall strategies as well included with this sign up. Okay, someone says going back to Algebra 2 in junior year, would it be okay to take the prep course the summer before senior year? Ooh, okay. That would be cutting it a little bit close in my opinion. Of course, it could depend on your particular situation, but for that situation, I would start thinking about test prep in the spring of junior year. I would not leave it till the summer before senior year, only out of worry that something happens and you only go take the test once. And the thing is, you want to take the test about 2 to 3 times the official test. And that's because you can super score that helps negate any fluctuations. So I would say that'd be playing it pretty close. But if you happen to have it scheduled out well, that would be okay too. That would be something to talk with your college counselor, I think, about a little bit more, just depending on your situation. If my daughter drops a certain course for whatever reason, would it show up on her transcript? I don't know, actually. I would ask their guidance counselor at school. I'm sure different schools do it different ways. That would be a question for them, unfortunately. Sorry about that. All right. So any other questions about test optional I can answer for you guys, anything like that? Now it's a little bit weird, but like I said, there's just a little bit more research involved kind of preparing for this. And again, kind of spending a little bit more time thinking about your whole application and curating the application for each school. All right, well, if you guys don't have any more questions, you are free to go. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Hopefully I see you guys at another webinar in the future, whether it's about the digital SAT or just the college admissions process or whatever. Hopefully you guys will come back. Hopefully I'll see you, or I won't see you guys, but hopefully you will join us for the test prep kickoff as well. But yeah, so if you don't have any other questions, y'all are free to go, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening.